the man who was supposed to be on his way to peace talks, spent the night in Washington. That is where this story begins. Not with a missile strike, not with a tanker exploding, not with a new speech from Tehran, with an absence. Roads in Islamabad were being prepared. Security measures were still in place. Delegations were supposed to be coming. J.D. Vance was supposed to be leading the American team. And yet the most important seat in the room was still empty because nobody could say with confidence whether the Iranians would even show up. That is an unusual scene. A city prepared for diplomacy, a vice president still grounded, an Iranian delegation saying it has no plans to attend. And over all of it, one sentence from Donald Trump hanging like a lock on the door: the United States will not lift its blockade on Iranian ports until a deal is reached. That is the sentence that matters, because the real story is not that talks are delayed. The real story is that Washington is trying to turn the Strait of Hormuz from a battlefield into a bargaining table, and Tehran is trying to stop that bargaining table from becoming a surrender table. That is the deeper fight. Everything else in this story sits under that one line: the ports, the blockade, the ceasefire clock, the absent delegates, the uncertainty in Islamabad, the rising tension over who controls the terms of negotiation. If you miss that, you miss the whole thing, because on paper, this still looks like diplomacy. The ceasefire still exists. Technically, talks are still being discussed. Pakistan is still being spoken of as the place where the next phase could happen. Washington says it wants a deal. Iran says it wants dignity. Commentators still talk as though we are watching a normal peace process stumble forward in a chaotic war. That is not what this is. This is coercive diplomacy. And coercive diplomacy works only if the side being coerced accepts the premise that pressure will be reduced in exchange for concessions. Iran is refusing that premise. That is why the blockade matters so much. Iran-esque negotiators are not simply saying they dislike American terms. They are saying something sharper. They will not negotiate under the shadow of threats. And in their eyes, the blockade is not background pressure. It is the proof that Washington is trying to force talks to take place under military and economic duress. That is why the phrase table of surrender matters, because if Iran shows up while a blockade stays in place, it looks as if Tehran accepted the principle that America gets to choke Iranian ports first and negotiate second. That is not just a tactical problem for the Iranian side. It is a regime problem. It is a legitimacy problem. It is a prestige problem. The government cannot easily sell that internally as ordinary diplomacy. But if Iran refuses to show up, the blockade continues, the ceasefire edge gets closer, and the danger of renewed escalation rises. That is the first bad options tree inside this crisis at 10. And you look weak, refuse, and you lose time while the pressure stays on escalate, and you risk blowing up the ceasefire entirely. That is not a normal negotiating environment. That is a trap built around timing. And timing is now the entire story, because the 2-week ceasefire is nearing its end and there is no sign of a clean extension. The roads in Islamabad may still be blocked off and prepared, but preparation is not the same as progress. Vance has not left. Iran has not committed. Trump is still posting that the blockade stays. And in the middle of all of this, Iran's own side is sending an unmistakable warning. If diplomacy does not move on acceptable terms, Tehran is ready to show new cards on the battlefield. That phrase is doing a lot of work. New cards, not old grievances, not abstract anger. New cards. That is the language of a side reminding everyone that the battlefield is still open, even if the diplomats would prefer to pretend otherwise. And the battlefield card that matters most is not hidden in Tehran or Islamabad or Washington. It is sitting in the water, Hormuz. That is what makes this story so much bigger than a stalled meeting schedule, because the Strait of Hormuz is not just another choke point. Roughly 20% of the world, oil and liquefied natural gas flows through it. When shipping there slows, hesitates, or freezes, the effect is not regional. It goes global. Prices feel it. Shipping feels it. Politics feel it. Consumers feel it. Every government with inflation trouble feels it. Every importer feels it. That is why Trump wants a deal. Not just because he wants a diplomatic win, not just because he wants to avoid another Middle East spiral, but because oil is political, shipping is political, and a closed or half-closed Hormuz can become a domestic problem in countries far away from the Gulf very quickly. That is why this crisis is so unstable. Both sides know the strait is leverage. Washington is using its blockade on Iranian ports as leverage. Iran is using its ability to keep Hormuz unstable as leverage. And the unresolved question sitting in the middle of the talks is not just whether there will be another meeting. It is whether either side is prepared to give up the instrument of pressure that gives its negotiating position meaning. That is the second bad options tree. For Washington, lifting the blockade before a deal looks like surrendering leverage too early. For Tehran, coming to the table while the blockade remains looks like accepting coercion as the price of diplomacy. For both sides, keeping maximum pressure means that talks become less likely to happen at all. That is why the gap remains so wide. And it gets wider when you look at what the United States actually wants. Washington wants the Strait reopened. Washington wants a long-lasting deal. Washington wants Iranian-enriched uranium handed over. Those are not small asks. They go to the center of Iranian sovereignty, deterrence, and regional posture. Now look at what Iran is signaling back. Iran says the blockade has to be lifted to make talks viable. Iran says it will not negotiate under threats. Iran is still insisting that there are battlefield cards left to play. And according to the reporting in the file, the maximum Iran is willing to give still appears to be less than the minimum America is demanding. That is not a normal bargaining gap. That is the kind of gap that makes diplomacy look present while real settlement remains absent. That is why even outside experts are sounding bleak. The comparison to the original Iran nuclear talks is instructive. Those negotiations took years, countless meetings, technical experts, patience. In an environment in which both sides still believe there was room to trade detail for detail, what is happening here is the opposite. The timeline is brutally short, the demands are maximalist, the mistrust is deeper, the atmosphere is more openly coercive, and the battlefield is still producing pressure. At the same time, the diplomats are supposed to be producing compromise. That is not a formula for a clean breakthrough. At best, it is a formula for a temporary patch, a partial reopening, a short extension, a vague understanding, something that buys days instead of solving the structure, and the structure is what matters. Because the structure is now expanding beyond the United States and Iran. Look at China. Xi Jinping has now personally called for the Strait of Hormuz to remain open for normal passage. That alone is unusual enough to matter. Beijing had already been saying versions of this through lower-level channels, but when Xi says it directly to the Saudi crown prince, the message changes level. It becomes strategic. Why? Because China's stake in Hormuz is obvious. Energy flows matter to China. Shipping stability matters to China. A U.S. blockade on Iranian ports matters to China. And in the last 24 hours, a cargo ship coming from China and bound for Iran has reportedly been intercepted and boarded by the United States. That is not a side note. That is the third layer of this crisis, because once American pressure starts touching Chinese-linked shipping, even indirectly, the Hormuz crisis stops being merely a U.S.-Iran standoff with global economic consequences. It starts becoming a wider test of how far Washington is willing to use shipping pressure, how far Beijing is willing to tolerate it, and whether outside powers begin leaning harder on Tehran, Washington, or both. That is why Saudi Arabia matters too. The Saudi readout from Shia's call reportedly spoke about China and Saudi Arabia working together toward a pathway to lasting peace and stability. Diplomatic language always sounds soft until you ask what problem it is trying to solve. And here the problem is obvious. The Gulf states do not want a prolonged Hormuz crisis. China does not want prolonged Hormuz crisis. Markets do not want a prolonged Hormuz crisis, but the United States and Iran are still treating Hormuz as leverage because for both of them, leverage is now the last thing they can easily give away. That is the trap inside the trap. The world wants the waterway reopened, but the principal actors are still using closure, blockade, and reopening as bargaining tools. So the question is not simply whether talks happen. The real question is who blinks first on the instrument of pressure. Does Washington lift the blockade to get Iran back into the room? Does Iran return under pressure to avoid losing what little diplomatic runway remains? Does some partial formula emerge where the strait opens a little, the blockade softens a little, and both sides pretend a breakthrough happened when in reality they have only postponed a harder collision? Those are now the live options, and none of them is clean. For Trump, the blockade cannot be lifted casually because it is his most visible proof that pressure still means something. If he lifts it without extracting a real concession, he looks weak. If he keeps it too long and talks fail, he risks an oil and shipping shock he does not want. If he accepts a vague formula and calls it victory, he may buy time, but he will not solve the core dispute over uranium sovereignty and the future of Hormuz. For Iran, returning too quickly under blockade makes the regime look as if it negotiated only after being squeezed. Holding out, however, keeps the pressure in place and raises the risk that the ceasefire expires before diplomacy does anything useful. Escalating at sea or in the wider battlefield may restore some deterrent credibility, but it also brings back the possibility of a much larger confrontation for outside actors, especially China and Saudi Arabia. The danger is that their interests are tied to reopening the strait while the actual bargaining power still sits with two parties using the strait and the blockade as tools of coercion rather than as issues to be settled. That is why this feels less like a peace process and more like a contest over who gets to define the meaning of negotiation itself. Washington says pressure first, deal second. Tehran says lift the threat first, then talk. Both positions make internal sense together. They are almost incompatible. And that is why I think the cleanest way to read this moment is not talks may or may not happen. That is too shallow. The deeper reading is this. The United States is trying to force Iran into a diplomacy of concession, and Iran is trying to force the United States back into a diplomacy of reciprocity. Hormuz is the battlefield where that argument becomes real. That is why the Vice President Estelle matters. That is why the empty roads in Islamabad matter. That is why Trump's social media post matters. That is why the Iranian refusal matters. That is why Xi's phone call matters. That is why the intercepted ship matters. They are all pointing to the same structural fact. No one is actually arguing only about the meeting. They are arguing about the terms under which pressure becomes negotiation. And as long as that argument remains unresolved, the ceasefire may stay technically alive while the deeper crisis stays fully intact. That is the larger judgment here. The most dangerous thing about the Hormuz crisis right now is not that diplomacy has failed. It is that diplomacy is still being asked to function while both sides are using the most important pieces of pressure they have as proof that they cannot afford to bend. That is not stable. And it means the next real break in the story may come not from the conference room, but from whichever side first decides the bargaining table is no longer producing enough movement to justify the pressure it is still absorbing. If that happens, Hormuz stops being a negotiating issue again. It becomes a battlefield issue. And once that happens, the whole world will feel it.